Some of you clever beans will have guessed where my next spooky stop was, but I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in a previous video, so I'm not going to give you that much credit for it. My next stop on my journey was the beautiful city of San Francisco. I boarded a plane in Portland and I flew my way down to San Francisco. And my number one spooky destination in San Francisco was, of course, Alcatraz. Now, I don't want to be disparaging of anybody, but I feel like nicknaming Alcatraz the Rock, it was a lazy option, you know? There wasn't much cognitive power that was used in coming up with that nickname. I just feel like it could have been something better. And no, I'm not going to give my suggestions because I'm not going to have anybody stealing my ideas. Whatever about the unimaginative nickname, I really feel like Alcatraz is this big, foreboding, hulking mass that overlooks San Francisco. And when you are on that boat sailing out towards it, it feels simultaneously epic and a little bit eerie. It's crazy to imagine what the prisoners must have felt when they were being transported out there, to have this beast of a building waiting for you and to not know what was going to happen to you out there. One of the things I think that I was completely unaware of when I was going to Alcatraz was how important and symbolic Alcatraz was for the Native American people. Based on oral history, it seems that Alcatraz was used as a place of isolation or ostracization when tribal law was broken. Not only that, but it seems that it was a place for gathering bird eggs and sea life for food, and that Alcatraz was also used by Native Americans who were attempting to escape colonizers. Now, a lot of people might be watching this and going, yeah, we know, Emma, but I was really unaware of this story. Once Alcatraz became a prison, sometimes Native American people were sent there who passively opposed being removed from their own lands. There were actually 3 separate occupations of Alcatraz Island by Native American people. In 1964, there was an occupation that lasted only 4 hours. But on the 20th of November 1969, an occupation began which ended up lasting 19 months. And while the occupation in 1964 only lasted 4 hours, it was actually really important because during that occupation there was a demand that the island was used for a Native American cultural centre and what they referred to as an Indian university, and those demands resurfaced in 1969. So that short occupation in 1964 paved the way for the longer occupation in 1969. The occupation was led by a man named Richard Oakes. And immediately when the occupation began, an elected council was put into place. Everyone on the island had a job, security, sanitation, daycare, school, housing, cooking, laundry, etc. And all of the decisions were made by unanimous consent of the people. The Native American occupiers went into negotiation with the federal government, and for the Native Americans, the negotiations were fixed. They wanted the deed to the island, they wanted to establish an Indian university, a cultural centre and a museum. There was in place already a structure which meant that any land that was not used by the federal government could be laid claim to by Native Americans. And Alcatraz up until the occupation was not being used. However, the federal government were having none of it. They were like, you can't have any of those things and you need to leave the island. By early 1970, there was some friction among the occupiers of the island. A lot of the occupiers of the island were Native American students who began returning to university. And additionally, many non-Native Americans began taking up residency on the island. Many of them were from like the San Francisco hippie and drug culture. The final nail in the coffin for Richard Oakes was when his 13-year-old stepdaughter fell 3 floors down a stairwell to her death. And Oakes left the island after this point, and 2 competing groups then manoeuvred back and forth for leadership of the island. The government adopted this non-interference policy and just sort of watched from afar. And really what they were doing was seeing if they could wait the occupiers out. But then they decided that they would shut off all electrical power. They removed the water barge that was providing fresh water for the occupiers. And 3 days after this, a huge fire broke out on the island. Several historical buildings were destroyed. And as you can imagine, the government blamed the Native Americans and the Native Americans blamed the government. And as is often the case in stories like this, initially the public were supportive of the occupation, but by 1971 tides had begun to turn and public support was beginning to wane. In January 1971, 2 oil tankers collided in the entrance to the San Francisco Bay, and it was acknowledged that the lack of Alcatraz light or a foghorn played no part in the collision. It was enough to push the federal government into action. On June the 10th, 1971, armed federal marshals, FBI agents and special forces swarmed the island and removed 5 women, 4 children and 6 unarmed Native American men. So while Alcatraz was lost, the occupation gave birth to a political movement which continues to this day. As a result of the occupation, either directly or indirectly, the official government policy of termination of Native American tribes was ended, and a policy of Native American self-determination became the official US government policy. Now, I didn't know any of this, okay? That's the shorthand version of what happened. And the information that I just delivered to you came from the National Park Service website. And on the island, one of the first things that you see as a tourist is a really interesting exhibition that is all about the Native American occupation of Alcatraz. What was the build-up to it? What happened during the time? What was the public response to it? What happened afterwards? That's great. So super interesting. After the exhibition about the Native American occupation of Alcatraz, you then get to go on the tour of the prison, and you get headphones to do it. So there's no tour guides. You just get headphones and you stroll around with the headphones in your ears, and the headphones direct you where to go. Now listen, as somebody who doesn't like being around people very much, it was great for me. I talk all about Alcatraz and the ghost stories of Alcatraz in episode 209 of the podcast Real Life Ghost Stories. So for this portion of the video where I am bumbling around Alcatraz, I'm gonna play you a couple of ghost stories from that episode all about Alcatraz. You can just imagine my brain when I then got the job of doing night security on the Rock. All the stories my granddad had told me whirled around my brain, but the pay was decent and working nights worked well for my wife and kids. Like my grandfather, I had grown up with stories of the Rock, except my stories widely came from him, and I believed him. He always had this look when he spoke about Alcatraz, the look that suggested something about that place had intrinsically changed him as a person. When I was working nights there, I just kept telling myself that of course these stories were invented to cope with the working environment, and of course a male-dominated violent atmosphere would breed stories of monsters. When you're surrounded by monsters, you need to create bigger ones, right? That online psychology class I had done in that bleak period of unemployment had really had its time to shine with this one. When I worked at Alcatraz, I would sometimes do my rounds and imagine my grandfather young and comparatively innocent, becoming hardened and probably ruthless as time passed while he was working there. I don't think you could be sensitive in a place like Alcatraz and survive. My job was simple. I sat in a cabin reading, listening to podcasts, the usual, and then every couple of hours or so, I would do the rounds of the grounds and make sure that everything was in order. Up until this night, I had never had anything strange or untoward happen to me on the night shift. Sure, I would freak myself out on the regular, but as for actual paranormal experiences, there were none. Until this night. Everything was normal except for the fact that it was super foggy. I don't think I'd ever really seen a fog like it. When I stepped out of the cabin, I could barely see my hand in front of my face. It felt eerie, but of course it would feel eerie, being alone on this famously haunted rock in the fog. I did feel slightly resentful of having to do my rounds, though, if truth be known. I had visions of some angry spectre looming out of the fog at me. That didn't happen, obviously. But I think that a lot of people won't believe me when they hear this. They'll say it was the power of suggestion or that I misinterpreted something. But I had worked there for months at this stage and I felt like I knew the rock like the back of my hand, even in the fog. It happened in the shower room. I know that sounds like I'm about to make some thinly veiled attempt at a crude prison joke, but I assure you I am not. The shower room was always eerie to me anyway. The thought of all these grown men forced to shower side by side in this open plan room. The lack of dignity in it always gave me the shivers. But what also gave me the shivers were the stories that my granddad had told me about inmates being stabbed in the showers. Anyway, like I said, my round started with the shower room. I sort of had to walk in a circle around it with the shower heads all in the centre of the room. I can't really describe what happened, but something in the atmosphere shifted. It didn't feel colder and nothing physically changed that I could see, but I felt something change. It was like the air became thicker, maybe. It's hard to describe, but that's the best I can do. I had my headphones in at that point. I had found that blasting death metal was a surefire way to curb the fear somewhat. For whatever reason, I decided to take my headphones out. I think I needed to understand what it was that had caused this shift in the atmosphere, and I couldn't see anything had changed. So I suppose I thought I would hear if something had changed. I often think now about whether I regret taking out the earphones. And the answer is probably yes, mostly because I feel like people don't believe my story. I paused the music and took the earphones out, and for a brief second my ears adjusted to the sudden decline in noise. But there wasn't silence. There was a noise. Something different that I had never heard on the rock before, and I have never heard since. It was the sound of a banjo. Now look, I know it sounds absurd, but that's what it was. The sound of a banjo, and let me tell you, absurd or not, hearing it in that big open space, knowing that I was alone on this island was petrifying. I literally froze on the spot. I couldn't move, and I'm probably the worst security guard in history. But there was no mistaking that it was the sound of a banjo, playing a few warbling notes. It seemed to be coming from all around me, like it was just part of the air. And then it hit me. Al Capone. There was no way that this was happening. There was just no way. My granddad used to tell me this story about Al Capone. Pretty much everyone knows that Al Capone had been to Alcatraz, locked up for tax evasion, but he didn't die there. He had been shipped out to another facility because he was riddled with syphilis and it was eating away at his brain. Anyway, while Capone was on the rock, he was absolutely convinced that if he went outside into the rec yard, he would be murdered by someone. I suppose you don't get to that level of crime lord without ruffling a few of your competitors' feathers. However he did it, Capone managed to convince the guards that he couldn't spend the time in the rec yard and that he needed to do something else instead. So during exercise time, Capone would practice his banjo. And he would practice his banjo in the shower room. And here I was in the next century, listening to it. I remember thinking, surely not, this is ridiculous. But why on earth would anyone want to be here strumming a banjo in the shower room of Alcatraz in the middle of the night? For a moment I genuinely didn't know which was worse, the ghost of Al Capone or an actual human being also being on the island, hiding in the shadows with a banjo. I didn't know what else to do, so when the banjo stopped, I stayed going. It felt like my feet were encased in concrete with every step that I took, but I knew there was no one in that room with me. I knew the atmosphere changed, and I knew that I had heard a banjo. I made my way down to cell block A. I walked as quickly as I could and then made my way to cell block B, my torch scanning back and forth as I walked, but there was no sign of life. It was so faint at first that I almost missed it. It felt like intuition made me stop rather than the actual sound itself. But once I had stopped, I couldn't unhear it. It was worse than the banjo, 1,000,000 times worse. It was the sound of someone crying. More than one person crying. I took a big deep breath and I remember thinking to myself that there was no getting off this island and that I needed to be brave. Ghosts never harmed anyone, except, of course, for that story my granddad told me about the monster in cell 14D. I decided that I needed to find where the sound was coming from. Maybe it was a joke. Like some of the day staff had left a recorder to play these sounds. And I will admit that this thought did bolster me somewhat. I moved less gingerly this time towards what I thought to be the source of the noise. I moved along the thick stone wall, running my hands over it, engrossed in finding the source. But the source was the wall. I realised in horror. The crying was coming from inside the walls. I suddenly felt a blast of ice-cold wind in my face and the sound stopped. I was left in the silence of the night. That was it. I had heard the stories. I had probably heard all the stories about guards seeing figures in the cells that weren't there, about Warden Johnston, the Golden Rule warden who was escorting guests around when they all heard sobbing from the walls. Oh, that one definitely hit different now. The clanging of pipes and metal in the utility room. Oh, I had heard all of the stories, but job or no job, I was not hanging around in this building for 1 second longer. I sprinted out of the main building and was immediately met with a burst of light that stopped me in my tracks. The fog was still down, thick and heavy, but it had been illuminated by the light of the lighthouse. I remember in my panic idly thinking, well, thank fuck that a boat isn't going to crash onto the island, because that's all I would need tonight. I sprinted down the hill back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. Standing against it with my chest heaving, I realised that my shirt was drenched in a cold sweat. When I finally got my breathing under control, I tried to rationalise what had happened. It must have been a joke or a prank, and boy did they get me good. It was then that I noticed the darkness. The lighthouse had gone out. I felt a ringing in my ears as I thought again. I even said it out loud. The lighthouse has gone out. The lighthouse. Shit, the lighthouse. There was no lighthouse on Alcatraz. There hadn't been one for decades. But my granddad used to tell me that on certain nights, when the fog was particularly bad, the lighthouse would appear and illuminate the island once more. I didn't personally have any spooky experiences while I was on Alcatraz. However, it is a very, very eerie place, and I can imagine that if you were doing a ghost tour or if you were there at night time, it would be a completely different experience. One of the weirdest things about Alcatraz for me was that it was weirdly beautiful. When I went, it was a lovely sunny day, the flowers were in bloom, the birds were birding. I did mention in the episode that I saw some good bird action. Here they are, good bird action. The white fluffy ones are snowy egrets. They make a really ridiculous call, but they are beautiful. And the abundance of little blackbirds, they're Brandt's cormorants, and it was mating season. There was a lot of funky dancing going on. Thus endeth the spooky portion of the San Francisco vlog. And if you're wondering, what else do you vlog when you're away? I do like travel vlogs too, but I put them up on Patreon. Is that a shameless plug? Maybe. The next stop on the grand tour is San Diego. Have a guess at what spooky place I'm going to visit in San Diego, and I will see you next time.